and welcome to my take on the yesterday's pajama challenge. This challenge has been introduced by V from the channel SnappyDragon. I will link her video on the challenge on the top. And it's about making pajamas from past decades to jazz up our everyday wear. So I took part in this challenge because I wanted to make a 1930s nightgown for quite a long time. I have got a pattern magazine from 1930 about a year ago and never made anything from that. And I got it very cheap on a flea market. So I thought it was about time to make something from it. And I wanted to pick something that's rather simple because I never worked with a commercial pattern magazine before. And nothing like this in general. So this nightgown seemed like a pretty easy first thing I could do with this magazine. So the pattern just consists of two pieces. And this is the front and back piece, which is asymmetrical. And it closes on the shoulder with a bow and it ties around the waist with waist tape. So I started out by tracing the pattern onto my own paper, so I don't destroy this antique magazine, obviously. And I thought this is much harder to do than it actually was, but I found the lines pretty easily and I could follow them very easily too. Though I needed to be very close to the paper, hence my Hunchback of Notre Dame posture throughout this process. As instructed in the pattern, I had to elongate the side seams to reach 100 centimeters. And then I just drew the hem with a rather flat curve with my ruler and cut it all out. The fabric I chose as the main dress was a rather thick white rayon fabric with a little bit of elasticity to it. For the waist tape and shoulder bow, I used the blue synthetic silk. Then I pinned the dress pattern to the fabric, marked 1 centimeter seam allowance at the shoulder and the side seam, and cut it all out. To transfer the markings of the pattern onto the fabric, I cut out the circles on the pattern and marked them with a water removable marker on the fabric. And I did the very same for the two slits, where the waistband will go through later on. Though I just poked 2 holes with a pencil and marked those 2 dots on the fabric and connected them later. Then I ironed the 2 pieces, and I ironed them before cutting too, but the fabric got wrinkly very fast, so once more it was. All the different tapes and strips I needed got cut next. First, out of the white fabric, the base for the bow, which was about 70 centimeters long and about 5 centimeters wide, and that will close one shoulder seam, the one with the holes in it. Then I measured the length of the bias tape I would need by measuring the armholes, neckline and hem. And then I marked this amount of bias tape with a 45-degree angle, so it is cut on the bias of the fabric and it gives it a natural stretch. The other strips were cut from the blue synthetic fabric, and I cut 4 long strips, which was a quite tricky thing to do since the material shifted a lot around and had some elasticity as well. After that, I started to assemble, which was a rather simple step with this dress. Just 3 seams. First, I sewed the side seams as French seams, which means I pinned the layers wrong sides together and sewed that, with 1/2 centimeter seam allowance. Then trimmed it even further, so the seam allowance is about 3 millimeters or something. Then I pressed it and sewed it again, now right sides together, again with 1/2 centimeter seam allowance, so the raw edges are hidden inside the seams. And the other seam was the shoulder seam, and yes, just one shoulder seam, because the other one closes with the bow. The seam got finished by hand felling it, so the stitches aren't visible on the outside. After that followed a very important step actually. I tried to dress on to see if it fits nicely because I didn't make muslin before it. Because I thought the dress is simple enough that I don't need one. And I was correct. The only thing I needed to change was I had to make the armholes in the front a little bit more wider, since the front strap was very wide and it kind of looked a little bit awkward. So just cut this bit away to make it more narrow and copied this alteration to the other side by redrawing the cut piece there. After that, I started with making the bias tape. First I needed to sew it together so the natural stretch will stay in the tape. Then trimming the seam allowance away so it's as narrow as possible, because the smaller the seam allowance is, the flatter the finished tape will get. And then I had to press all that bias tape, which is a step I don't really like to do because it always gets a little bit wonky, even with the tool I'm using. But I do like bias tape finished edges, so yeah. And it also was clearly instructed on the pattern that all the edges are finished with bias tape, even the hem, so there was not really a way around. The iron bias tape got then pinned on, right side to right side, and sewn down in the fold. After sewing it down completely, I turned it around and pinned it down on the inside. But before sewing the inside of the bias tape on, I needed to make the holes for closing the other shoulder. Since there were no guides on how to make them on the pattern, I decided to make them with a larger facing that reinforces the whole strap, since I used rayon and not cotton, which is a little bit weaker than cotton is. And I pinned the facing to the right side and then very carefully stitched this little circle with my machine. After double checking if I sewed this right, I cut the circle open and notched the edges on the inside of the circles until I reached the seam. And then I turned it inside out by carefully pulling fabric through the hole with a needle, and then I could iron the facing flat on the inside because it was pretty wrinkly. The bottom of the facing, which goes directly against the base of the dress, got then hand sewn with very small whip stitches so it stays in place. And then the binding in that area got sewn into the facing. Speaking of the binding, stitching this into place was the next thing to do. So I made this all around with those tiny whip stitches or felling stitches, and I tried to catch just one thread of the dress itself, so again it should look invisible, almost invisible from the outside. After that was done, I made the facings for the slit on the waist, where I cut 4 cotton rectangles and made sure that they are exactly on the grain by pulling out threads on each sides. I then sewed those rectangles on by making a line where the slits are supposed to go, which is indicated on the pattern, and stitched almost the shape of a buttonhole around that line, like a very narrow rectangle. This got then cut open along the line I drew before, and also notched in a V shape at the corners, up until the stitching line. Don't be afraid to get very close to the stitching line when doing things like that, but make sure you don't actually cut it because, well, that would pretty much ruin it. But no pressure. Then I turned the slits inside out and pressed them flat. I also pressed all over the raw edges so they are hidden. As with everything else in this dress, I also hand stitched the slit facing on with very tiny whip stitches by hand. That again only caught one thread of the base dress, so it doesn't show up too much on the outside. After all that was done, the base dress was all ready. All that was left to be done was the blue bands. First I made the shoulder bow, where I sewed the two narrow blue strips on each side, which will later act as sort of a binding. After sewing these two strips on with 1 centimeter seam allowance, it looked a little bit too wide, so I trimmed the seam allowance away, so it is just 1/2 centimeter, which looked far more elegant when the tape was turned over. So I ironed the blue straps flat and turned them over and sewed them on by hand, trying to hide the stitches as good as possible, because if you make a bow, both sides are visible. But when I was done with that, I was confronted with a very small but significant problem. The holes I made were too small to fit the bow through. And I believe this is because in the 30s they would have used a far finer fabric for this than I. My solution was to make a little Frankenstein bow, where I made a small tube and threading that through the holes. And then I cut the original bow in half, gathered it and sewed it into this tube, which has the downside that I can't get the bow out again, which also ruins the whole purpose of having it, but it still is a nice little visual detail. Now onto the waistband, which was far less problematic and stressful. I just took the 4 strips I cut earlier and pieced them together so it had 2 long strips, then folded them in half and sewed them close, 2 centimeters away from the edge. Then I trimmed the allowance down, again to reduce bulk on the inside, and pressed the seam allowance open. Then I could turn the band right side out by sewing a very strong thread on one side and pulling it through with a blunt needle. After the thread is through, it will all be bunched up, but then the end will eventually slowly come through, and it's a little bit fiddly work, but once you get the hang of it, it's pretty easy. And then the thread is cut away and the edges were turned inside, and those edges got then stitched close, and that made the dress complete. Now I really hope you enjoyed this rather long video of a relatively simple dress, and I very much hope you stay tuned for my next videos. Thank you all for your love and support and the lovely comments I get so often, and thank you for watching.